stretched out like endless corridors, their shelves stacked with neatly organized goods that seemed to stretch into infinity under the dim overhead lights. The fluorescents flickered faintly, buzzing like a distant swarm of insects. Maria had worked the graveyard shift at this Walmart for 6 months, and though she was used to the solitude, something about tonight felt different. The store seemed quieter than usual, almost unnaturally so. She glanced at the clock above the customer service desk. 1:13 a.m. The rest of her co-workers had spread out across the store to complete their tasks, leaving her alone at the front to sort through a new shipment of returns. She absently brushed a strand of dark hair from her face, her hands working through a bin of unsorted items. Her eyes darted to the security cameras mounted in the corners of the ceiling. Their slow mechanical sweep was a familiar presence, yet tonight their movements seemed off, almost hesitant, as if the cameras were searching for something. The faint sound of a shopping cart's wheels squeaking echoed from somewhere deep within the store. Maria froze, her hand hovering over the bin of items. It wasn't unusual for customers to wander in at odd hours, but the noise seemed to come from an area no one had been working in. She strained her ears, trying to pinpoint the direction of the sound, but it stopped just as abruptly as it had started. Shrugging it off as her imagination, she returned to her task, sorting through a stack of mismatched shoes. The seconds dragged by, each tick of the clock seeming louder than the last. Then she heard it again, the faint squeak of wheels, but this time it was closer. "Hello," Maria called out, her voice breaking the silence. It echoed through the empty aisles, the sound bouncing back to her in an eerie mimicry. No response came. She stood, brushing off her jeans and peering down the nearest aisle. The overhead lights cast long shadows, and the rows of neatly lined merchandise seemed to loom taller than usual. Her eyes caught a flicker of movement near the toy section. It was subtle, like the edge of a shadow shifting, but when she focused on the spot, it was empty. The uneasy feeling in her chest deepened. She reached for the walkie clipped to her waistband, thumbing the button. "Hey, is anyone in the toy section? I thought I saw something." Static crackled through the device before Kevin, one of her co-workers, replied. "Nah, I'm over in electronics. Might be an old cart rolling around. Happens all the time. Wind from the vents or something." "Wind? Inside the store?" She frowned but didn't argue. "Okay, thanks." Her thumb released the button, and the static faded into silence. She felt ridiculous for being so jumpy, but there was something about the way the sound had carried, almost deliberate in its pacing. She decided to check it out, if only to ease her nerves. The toy section was several aisles down, and the closer she got, the colder the air became. It wasn't the chill of air conditioning, but something sharper, more invasive, that seemed to seep through her skin and settle in her bones. As she rounded the corner, the faint scent of plastic and rubber met her nose, familiar yet somehow unsettling in its intensity. The aisle was empty, save for the rows of colorful toys lining the shelves. Dolls with fixed, glassy eyes stared blankly into the distance, their perfect smiles frozen in plastic. A toy fire truck sat abandoned in the middle of the floor, its wheels slightly askew. Maria bent to pick it up, the small sound of the wheels squeaking as she rolled it into place on the shelf. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper brushed past her ear, too faint to make out the words. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. The aisle was still empty, but the oppressive feeling of being watched grew stronger. Her eyes scanned the shelves, lingering on the rows of dolls. One of them seemed out of place, its head tilted slightly as if observing her. She reached out hesitantly, brushing her fingers against its smooth surface, and felt an unexpected warmth, as though it had been sitting in the sun. A loud crash from the next aisle over made her jump, She peered around the corner and froze. A tower of stacked boxes had toppled over, spilling their contents across the floor. The fluorescent lights above flickered violently, casting erratic shadows that danced along the walls. And then she saw it, just at the edge of her vision, a figure standing perfectly still at the far end of the aisle. It was tall and impossibly thin, its shape barely distinguishable from the darkness that seemed to cling to it. Maria blinked, and the figure was gone. Her stomach churned as she backed away, her hands trembling. She fumbled for her walkie again. "Kevin, are you near Housewares? There's something over here." Static hissed in response, but no voice came through. "Kevin, can you hear me?" She tried again, her voice rising with panic. The walkie crackled, and then faintly, she heard the whisper again. This time it was clearer, though still incomprehensible. It sent a cold shiver racing down her spine. She dropped the walkie, its plastic casing clattering against the floor, and turned on her heel, sprinting back toward the front of the store. Her footsteps echoed loudly as she ran, the aisles blurring past her. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed and flickered, casting the store into a strobe-like chaos. She didn't dare look back, the overwhelming sensation of being pursued driving her forward. When she finally reached the front desk, she collapsed against it, her chest heaving. The store was silent again, the oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly. She glanced at the clock. It was 2:07 a.m. Somehow, only minutes had passed, though it felt like hours. She looked out toward the sliding glass doors at the entrance, their reflection showing the empty store behind her. But as she stared, the shadows near the toy section seemed to ripple, coalescing into a shape that stood perfectly still, watching her. The store's oppressive silence seemed to deepen with every passing second. Maria's chest still heaved as she stood near the customer service desk, her trembling hands clutching the counter for support. The reflection in the sliding glass doors lingered in her peripheral vision, but she didn't dare look directly at it again. Instead, she focused on the faint hum of the building's air conditioning, hoping to drown out the gnawing fear that threatened to consume her. Her walkie-talkie lay abandoned on the floor where she had dropped it, the static now faint and irregular. Maria forced herself to breathe deeply, trying to steady her shaking legs. The sense of being watched hadn't left. It was stronger now, pressing on her like an invisible weight. She glanced at the clock again. One item. The night was dragging on at an agonizing pace. A low, distant sound pulled her from her thoughts. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, like the rustle of fabric or a breath caught in the wrong place. She tilted her head, straining to listen, her pulse quickening. The sound came again, this time clearer, a soft, deliberate tapping, as though something was moving slowly along the tile floor. Her eyes darted to the aisles behind her, their dimly lit rows stretching endlessly into shadow. The tapping grew louder, closer, echoing through the cavernous space. It wasn't random. The pattern was deliberate, methodical, and unhurried, as though whatever was making it knew exactly where it was going. Maria crouched down, her breath shallow, and peered around the edge of the desk. The aisle before her was empty, its stillness almost mocking. But the sound continued, now accompanied by the faint scrape of something dragging across the floor. She pressed her back against the counter, her mind racing. She wasn't imagining this. Someone, or something, was in the store with her. The lights above flickered, their erratic buzzing filling the void. Shadows shifted and stretched unnaturally, distorting the edges of the room. Maria's fingers dug into the cool surface of the counter as she debated her next move. She couldn't just stay here, frozen in fear. If she didn't do something, she felt certain that whatever was stalking her would find her soon enough. She swallowed hard and pushed searching for any sign of movement. The tapping had stopped, leaving behind an almost suffocating silence. She reached for the small flashlight clipped to her waistband and clicked it on. The beam of light cut through the gloom, illuminating the rows of shelves and the faint glint of plastic packaging. Everything looked normal. Too normal. Gathering her courage, Maria stepped cautiously away from the desk, the soles of her sneakers squeaking softly against the polished tile. She kept the flashlight steady, her other hand gripping the edge of the counter for balance. The silence felt alive, pressing against her ears and making her hyper-aware of every sound she made. As she rounded the corner into one of the aisles, her flashlight caught something strange. A single doll sat in the middle of the floor, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Maria froze, her breath catching in her throat. She was sure the aisle had been empty just minutes ago. The doll's glossy eyes seemed to glint in the flashlight's beam, their lifeless stare fixed on her. The tapping sound resumed, louder and more erratic this time, echoing through the store as if coming from every direction at once. Maria's flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering weakly before stabilizing. Her heart pounded as she turned in a slow circle, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. Then came the whisper. It was faint at first, like the murmur of distant voices carried on a breeze. The sound grew clearer, though the words were still indistinguishable. It seemed to surround her, coming from nowhere and everywhere all at once. Her skin prickled with goosebumps as the whispering swirled around her, rising and falling in an almost melodic rhythm. Maria stumbled backward, her flashlight swinging wildly as she tried to find something, anything that could explain what was happening. Her foot caught on the edge of a fallen display box, sending her sprawling to the floor. The impact knocked the flashlight from her hand, its beam skittering across the tiles before settling on the far end of the aisle. She scrambled to her feet, her hands trembling as she retrieved the flashlight. The whispering had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that felt even worse. She shone the light down the aisle, her breath hitching as she caught sight of another figure. It stood motionless at the far end, its form shrouded in shadow. Unlike the vague shapes she had glimpsed earlier, this figure was unnervingly distinct. It was tall and humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong, its limbs too long, its posture unnaturally hunched. The darkness seemed to cling to it like a second skin, rippling and shifting in a way that made Maria's stomach churn. The flashlight flickered again, and in that brief moment of darkness, the figure was gone. Maria's chest heaved as panic threatened to overtake her. She stumbled backward, her legs nearly giving out beneath her. The tapping resumed, louder and closer, like a relentless drumbeat chasing her through the aisles. She turned and ran, her sneakers squealing against the tile as she made her way toward the break room. The narrow hallway leading to the back of the store felt impossibly long, its dim lights casting uneven shadows on the walls. She pushed through the swinging door and slammed it shut behind her, bracing herself against it as she gasped for air. The break room was small and sparsely furnished, its walls lined with lockers and a vending machine humming softly in the corner. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed faintly, its glow flickering intermittently. Maria pressed her ear against the door, straining to hear any sign of movement outside. The tapping had stopped again, but the silence was far from comforting. It felt heavy, oppressive, as though the air itself had thickened. She took a shaky step back from the door, her eyes darting around the room. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper than they should have been, almost liquid in their consistency. Her flashlight's beam trembled as she scanned the room, the light catching on the glossy surface of the vending machine. For a moment, she thought she saw a reflection moving in the glass, something that wasn't her own. Her breath hitched as she turned to look behind her, but the room was empty. creak echoed through the break room, followed by a low guttural sound that sent shivers racing down her spine. The sound came from the ceiling, a soft, rhythmic thudding, as though something heavy was crawling above her. Dust drifted down from the tiles, swirling in the flashlight's beam. Maria backed away slowly, her eyes fixed on the ceiling as the thudding grew louder, more deliberate. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as the oppressive atmosphere tightened its grip. She didn't know what was up there, but she was certain it wasn't anything human. The low, rhythmic thudding above her intensified, each sound reverberating through the room like an ominous heartbeat. Maria stood frozen in the middle of the break room, her flashlight trembling in her hand. Dust rained down from the ceiling tiles, swirling lazily in the dim beam of light. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the source of the noise, her mind racing with possibilities. Whatever was crawling above her wasn't part of any rational explanation she could muster. The faint hum of the vending machine seemed deafening now, its mechanical drone filling the tense silence between each creak and thud. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths as she took an unsteady step backward. The edge of her heel caught the leg of a chair, and the soft screech of metal on tiles sliced through the suffocating quiet. The noise wasn't loud, but it felt catastrophic in the stillness. The sound above her stopped. The absence of noise was somehow worse, the silence heavier, as if the entire room was holding its breath alongside her. She strained her ears, her pulse pounding loudly in her head. For a moment, she thought maybe whatever it was had moved on, but the ceiling tiles groaned faintly, a sound so subtle it made her doubt whether she had imagined it. The fluorescent light flickered again, casting fleeting shadows across the walls. One of the corners seemed darker than the rest, the shadows pooling unnaturally as though they had weight and substance. Maria's gaze flicked toward it, her heart skipping a beat when she thought she saw movement. It wasn't dramatic, just a ripple in the darkness, like something shifting ever so slightly out of place. Her grip on the flashlight tightened as she inched toward the door. She wasn't sure where she intended to go, but staying in the break room felt like a death sentence. The weight of the silence pressed down on her with every step, her movements slow and deliberate. She reached for the door handle, her fingertips brushing the cold metal. And then it happened. The ceiling tiles above her erupted in a burst of sound, a deafening crash as one of them gave way. She barely had time to process what was happening before something heavy landed on the table in the center of the room. Her flashlight beam wavered as she stumbled backward, her foot catching on the edge of the same chair she'd bumped into earlier. She hit the floor hard, the breath knocked out of her as her flashlight rolled across the tile, its light skittering wildly around the room. The thing on the table moved. It was hunched, its limbs impossibly long and thin, its body shrouded in an unnatural darkness that seemed to defy the light. The shadows clung to it, twisting and writhing like living tendrils. Its head turned toward her, a jerky, unnatural movement that sent a fresh wave of terror coursing through her veins. Maria scrambled backward, her hands slipping on the cold floor as she tried to put as much distance between herself and the thing as possible. It didn't chase her. It didn't need to. The way it tilted its head, almost curiously, made her stomach churn. It knew she was trapped. The vending machine's hum stuttered and died, plunging the room into an even deeper silence. The thing shifted, its long fingers dragging across the table's surface with a sound that made her skin crawl. It didn't have a face, not in the traditional sense. Its head was featureless, a smooth, dark surface that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. And yet, Maria felt its gaze, a palpable weight that bore down on her like an invisible hand. Her flashlight rolled to a stop near the far wall, its beam angled upward to cast faint light creature. It twitched, recoiling slightly from the illumination, as though the light caused it pain. Maria's heart leapt at the realization, her mind latching onto the glimmer of hope. If it hated the light, then maybe, just maybe, she had a chance. She lunged for the flashlight, her fingers closing around its cool metal surface. The sudden movement seemed to jolt the creature into action. It let out a low, guttural sound that resonated deep in her chest, a noise so primal and otherworldly it made her want to cover her ears and scream. It moved faster than she expected, its long limbs propelling it toward her with an almost insect-like efficiency. Maria rolled onto her back, swinging the flashlight up and aiming the beam directly at it. The creature hissed, a sharp, grating sound that filled the room as it recoiled from the light. The shadows around it seemed to ripple violently, as though trying to shield it from the glare. She didn't hesitate, scrambling to her feet and shining the beam at every corner where the darkness seemed to thicken. The break room door was just a few steps away, and she didn't waste a second. She bolted for it, her sneakers squealing against the tile as she yanked the door open and fled into the hallway. The sound of the creature's hissing followed her, but it didn't give chase. It stayed behind, retreating into the shadows as though tethered to them. The hallway was just as dark, the flickering emergency lights casting sporadic, uneven beams that did little to comfort her. Maria clutched the flashlight tightly, her fingers aching from the force of her grip. She forced herself to keep moving, her breaths coming in ragged gasps as she scanned every corner, every shadow for signs of movement. The store felt different now. The oppressive atmosphere had grown heavier, the air thick with an almost electric charge. The shadows seemed to shift and writhe on their own, distorting the familiar aisles into something alien and menacing. Every sound felt amplified, the soft hum of the few working lights, the faint creak of shelves settling, even the sound of her own breathing. She thought she was alone until she heard the whisper again. It was closer this time, clearer, the faint murmur of voices just beyond her understanding. The sound came from all around her, filling the air like an unseen chorus. Maria's legs felt like they would give out at any moment, but she pressed on, her flashlight sweeping frantically across the aisles. As she neared the entrance, the glass doors came into view. For a fleeting moment, relief surged through her. She could see the parking lot, the faint glow of street lights beyond the doors. She was so close, but the reflection in the glass made her stop dead in her tracks. It wasn't her reflection staring back at her. It was something else. The creature from the break room, its shadowy form towering behind her, its faceless head tilted in that same unnatural way. Her breath caught as the reflection moved, stepping forward, even as she stood frozen in place. She didn't have time to scream before the lights above her flickered once more, plunging the store into darkness. The sudden plunge into darkness swallowed the store whole, leaving Maria trapped in a void where her only anchor was the faint beam of her trembling flashlight. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as though the shadows themselves were alive, pressing against her skin and filling her lungs. She stood frozen near the glass doors, her heart hammering in her chest, her breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. The reflection was gone. Maria dared a glance at the glass, hoping, praying, that the figure behind her had been a trick of the light, a figment of her imagination brought on by exhaustion and fear. But the emptiness of the reflection brought no comfort. The parking lot beyond the doors was eerily still, the streetlights casting long, undisturbed shadows across the asphalt. She could feel it, though, the presence. It was still there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for her to make a mistake. The soft hum of electricity crackled back to life as the emergency lights flickered overhead, casting the aisles in a dim, sickly glow. The reprieve was brief. Just as quickly as they came on, the lights buzzed and died again, leaving Maria in darkness once more. The flashlight's beam quivered as she turned it toward the aisles, her hands shaking so badly the light wavered erratically. The whispering returned. It was faint at first, barely more than a murmur, but it grew louder, more insistent, like a chorus of voices just out of reach. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, wrapping around her like a thick fog. Maria turned in a slow circle, her flashlight darting toward every corner, every shifting shadow, but she saw nothing. The whispers weren't words, at least not words she could understand. They were fragmented, guttural, and otherworldly language that made her skin crawl. A loud clang shattered the oppressive noise, echoing from deep within the store. Maria jumped, nearly dropping her flashlight as the sound reverberated through the aisles. It was metallic, deliberate, as though something heavy had been thrown or toppled over. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to leave the store and never look back, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. The clang came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were slow, uneven, dragging slightly against the tile floor. Maria's heart sank as she realized they were coming from the direction of the break room, the same direction she had just fled from. She backed away from the sound, her breath catching as her shoulder brushed against the cold glass of the door. She pressed her back against it, her free hand fumbling for the handle behind her. It didn't budge. Panic flared in her chest as she realized the doors were locked, the automatic mechanism disabled for the night. The footsteps stopped. Maria's flashlight shook as she aimed it down the main aisle. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating the shelves and the occasional abandoned cart. For a moment, there was nothing. No movement, no sound, just the suffocating quiet and her own ragged breathing. Then she saw it. A shadow moved at the edge of the flashlight's beam, slipping between the shelves with an unnatural grace. It was quick, almost too quick to track, but its presence was unmistakable. The whispering surged again, louder this time, a dissonant cacophony that filled the space like a rising tide. Maria turned the flashlight toward the shadow, but it darted out of sight before the beam could catch it. Her chest tightened as she realized it wasn't alone. More shadows flickered in the periphery of her vision, shifting and merging with the darkness around them. They were everywhere, closing in, their movements erratic and unsettling, like predators toying with their prey. The metallic clang sounded again, this time from the aisle to her left. Maria swung her flashlight toward the noise, the beam landing on a shopping cart that had been pushed into the middle of the walkway. It wobbled slightly before coming to a stop, as though something unseen had just let go of it. She swallowed hard, her throat dry as sandpaper, and took a cautious step forward. Her instincts told her to keep the light moving, to sweep it across the aisles and corners, but her hand refused to cooperate. The beam remained fixed on the cart, her mind unable to process the impossibility of what she had just witnessed. A low, guttural growl broke the silence, vibrating through the floor and into her bones. It wasn't human, nor was it animal. It was something in between, a deep, resonant sound that carried with it a primal sense of dread. Maria staggered backward, her flashlight darting wildly as the growl turned into a low, rasping breath. "Who's there?" she managed to choke out, her voice trembling. It felt absurd to speak, as though words had no place in the oppressive reality she found herself in. The shadows didn't answer. Instead, one of them shifted, stepping into the edge of the flashlight's beam. It was tall, impossibly so, with elongated limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally as it moved. Its form was indistinct, shrouded in a darkness that seemed to pulse and writhe like smoke. Where a face should have been, there was nothing but a void, a featureless expanse that seemed to draw the light into itself. Maria stumbled back, her flashlight shaking as she tried to keep the creature in her sights. The whispers swelled around her, a maddening symphony that seemed to mock her fear. She turned and bolted down the nearest aisle, her footsteps pounding against the tile as she weaved through the shelves. The air grew colder with every step, the oppressive chill seeping into her lungs and making it hard to breathe. The whispers followed her, growing louder and more chaotic, blending with the sound of her own panicked gasps. She didn't dare look back, but she could feel it, the weight of its presence, the way the shadows seemed to shift and stretch toward her as she ran. The store felt endless, its familiar layout twisted and distorted into a labyrinth of dread. When she finally stopped, her legs trembling and her chest heaving, she found herself in the toy section. The shelves were lined with brightly colored boxes and dolls with fixed, glassy eyes. They seemed to watch her as she moved, their expressions frozen in eerie smiles that made her skin crawl. Her flashlight flickered, the beam dimming and sputtering as though the batteries were dying. Maria shook it desperately, but the light continued to weaken, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the walls. The whispers rose to a crescendo, and from the corner of her eye, she saw the shadows begin to coalesce once more. This time, there was nowhere to run. The air in the toy section felt colder than the rest of the store, carrying with it a stillness so profound it seemed to dampen even Maria's ragged breathing. The faint hum of the overhead lights had disappeared entirely, leaving only the soft creak of the shelves and the distant, dissonant whispers that echoed faintly in her ears. Her flashlight sputtered weakly, its beam growing more erratic with every passing moment, casting fractured light across the rows of unnervingly lifelike dolls. Maria's chest tightened as her eyes darted from shadow to shadow. Each one seemed to shift imperceptibly, their edges writhing in ways that defied explanation. She could feel something closing in, a presence that pressed against her senses like a weight. It wasn't just one thing. It was many, scattered and yet unified, their collective gaze piercing through the darkness and pinning her in place. Her heart jumped as one of the dolls fell from the shelf with a soft thud, landing on its side just a few feet away. Its glassy eyes stared up at her, unblinking, its painted smile cracked slightly along the edges. She knelt slowly, her trembling hand extending toward the fallen figure. But before her fingers could graze its surface, she froze. A faint rustling sound drifted from behind her, barely audible but unmistakable in the oppressive silence. Maria's breath caught as she slowly turned her head, the beam of her flashlight shaking as it swung toward the noise. For a moment, there was nothing, just the endless rows of shelves and the oppressive darkness between them. But then she saw it, a shadow moving against the far wall, its form shifting and rippling like smoke. Her flashlight flickered again, and the shadow darted out of sight. Maria scrambled to her feet, the doll forgotten as she backed away, her pulse thundering in her ears. The whispers grew louder, their tones rising and falling like a chant, their words still incomprehensible, but carrying an undeniable malice. The shelves around her began to groan softly, the faint sound of shifting plastic and metal joining the growing cacophony. She whipped her flashlight around, the weak beam catching glimpses of toys that seemed to move ever so slightly. A stuffed bear slumping forward, a remote control car rolling an inch, a doll's head tilting just enough to make her stomach churn. It wasn't overt, but it was enough to send chills racing down her spine. Her back hit the edge of the aisle, and she turned to find herself staring down a long, narrow corridor lined with rows of action figures. Their faces, frozen in exaggerated expressions of swallowed almost instantly by the oppressive quiet. As she neared the center of the aisle, the temperature dropped sharply, her breath now visible in faint puffs that dissipated too quickly in the still air. The whispers quieted, fading into an eerie, expectant silence that made her skin crawl. The flashlight's beam swept across the figures on the shelves, their glossy eyes reflecting the light in unnerving ways. Then, from behind her, came a faint, deliberate tap, tap, tap. Maria spun around, the flashlight jerking wildly as her hands shook. The sound had come from just behind her, closer than she wanted to admit. The aisle was empty, the shadows still, but she could feel it again, that suffocating presence pressing against her senses, crawling under her skin. Her grip on the flashlight tightened as she took a step backward, her eyes scanning every inch of the space around her. The tapping sound came again, this time from her left, followed by a soft, almost imperceptible scraping noise. She turned toward it, her flashlight beam landing on one of the action figures. Its arm had fallen out of place, hanging limply at its side in a way that made her stomach twist. The whispers returned, louder and more frenzied, their tones rising and falling in a chaotic, almost rhythmic pattern. The shadows around her began to shift again, coalescing into shapes that flickered just at the edge of her vision. Maria stumbled backward, her foot catching on a discarded toy. She barely managed to catch herself, her flashlight clattering to the floor and rolling a few feet away. She scrambled for it, her fingers brushing the cool metal, just as the temperature in the room dropped further, a deep, bone-chilling cold that left her gasping. She grabbed the flashlight and swung it upward, the beam landing on a figure standing at the far end of the aisle. It was tall and impossibly thin, its elongated limbs ending in fingers that stretched too far, their tips grazing the floor. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, its featureless face shrouded in a darkness that seemed to ripple like water. It stood motionless, its presence radiating a quiet menace that froze Maria in place. The flashlight flickered again, its beam growing dimmer as the creature began to move. It didn't walk. Its form seemed to glide, the shadows bending and stretching around it as it came closer. The whispers grew louder, their cadence rising to a deafening crescendo that made Maria clap her hands over her ears. Her flashlight went out completely, plunging her into darkness. The whispers stopped, leaving only the sound of her own labored breathing and the faint rustle of movement in the shadows. Maria stumbled backward, her hands outstretched in a desperate attempt to find the end of the aisle. A faint glow appeared ahead of her, a pale, cold light that seemed to emanate from nowhere. It illuminated the figure now standing just a few feet away, its long fingers outstretched as if reaching for her. Maria's breath hitched as the figure tilted its head again, the movement slow and deliberate, almost curious. The shadows around the screen deepened, stretching outward and swallowing the nearby shelves. Maria's hands trembled as she aimed her flashlight at the encroaching darkness. The beam flickered and dimmed, barely piercing the suffocating void. A faint guttural sound echoed from the depths, sending a shiver racing down her spine. The figures on the screen grew clearer, their distorted forms almost humanoid, but lacking faces. They moved closer, their shapes pressing against the glass as though trying to escape. Maria scrambled backward, her breath hitching as one of the figures raised a long, spindly arm and pointed directly at her. The hum grew louder, accompanied by the faint scrape of something moving just out of sight. Maria's flashlight died completely, leaving her bathed in the flickering glow of the television. The air around her seemed to pulse, heavy with an unseen energy that made her skin crawl. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it, a shadow detaching itself from the wall and gliding toward her with an unnatural grace. It was taller than any human, its limbs impossibly thin and elongated. The featureless void where its face should have been tilted slightly, as though studying her. Maria tried to move, but her body refused to obey. The cold around her intensified, freezing her in place as the shadow loomed closer. The whispers returned, quieter now, but filled with an undeniable malice that seeped into her very being. The last thing she saw before the light from the television blinked out was the shadow enveloping her, its darkness swallowing the world whole. The darkness around Maria was absolute, pressing against her skin like a suffocating shroud. The air was heavy, stagnant, carrying with it an unfamiliar metallic tang that lingered at the back of her throat. She strained her ears for any sound, any indication of what surrounded her, but the silence was so complete that it made her ears ring. Then faintly, the whispers returned. They were softer now, a low murmur that seemed to seep into her mind rather than her ears. The words were incomprehensible, fragments of a language that felt ancient and wrong. They swirled around her, growing louder and quieter in an unsteady rhythm that made her feel as though the very air was alive. Her breath came in shallow gasps, the cold seeping into her bones as her body refused to move. A flicker of light appeared in the distance, faint and wavering, like the glow of a dying candle. Maria's body tensed as she watched the light pulse gently, its weak glow casting long, distorted shadows across the shelves. She couldn't see what was creating it, but it was moving, slowly, deliberately, coming closer with each pulse. Her hand trembled as she reached for the flashlight at her side, fumbling with the switch. The device gave a soft click, but refused to turn on, its batteries long drained. The light in the distance flared suddenly, momentarily bright enough to illuminate the aisle. The sight made her stomach drop. The shelves around her were empty. What had once been filled with rows of neatly arranged toys and games now stood bare, the metal racks coated in a thin layer of dust that seemed to shimmer in the faint light. Maria blinked, her mind struggling to process the impossibility of it. The light pulsed again, and this time she saw something else. A figure stood at the far end of the aisle, its form cloaked in shadows that writhed and shifted as though alive. It was impossibly tall, its elongated limbs ending in fingers that scraped the floor with each subtle movement. Where its face should have been was a void, a swirling blackness that seemed to draw the light toward it. The whispers grew louder, their cadence matching the faint flicker of the distant light. Maria's legs felt like lead as she tried to back away, her movements slow and uncoordinated. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching her, or at least, that's what it felt like. Despite its faceless void, she could feel its attention, a piercing, unrelenting pressure that made her knees threaten to buckle. The light pulsed once more, brighter this time, and Maria realized with growing dread that the figure was closer now. It hadn't moved, not in any way she could perceive, but the distance between them had closed. Her breath hitched as the whispers surged around her, overlapping into a cacophony of voices that filled her head with a dull, throbbing ache. Her foot caught on something, and she stumbled backward, her shoulder hitting the edge of a shelf. The sound echoed loudly in the oppressive silence, the metallic clang reverberating through the store. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of her own rapid breathing. She turned her head, her eyes scanning the empty shelves for any sign of movement. The aisle was still, the faint light now gone. The cold around her intensified, biting into her skin as though the air itself had turned hostile. She tried to stand, her hands gripping the edge of the shelf for support, but the sound of a soft, deliberate step made her freeze. It was close, far too close, and her heart pounded in her chest as she forced herself to look. The figure was right in front of her, It loomed over her, its featureless face tilted at an unnatural angle. The shadows that clung to its body pulsed and shifted, creating shapes that seemed to ripple like smoke. Maria's breath caught as the metallic tang in the air grew stronger, sharp and acrid, filling her nose and mouth with a taste that made her stomach churn. The figure raised one of its elongated arms, its fingers stretching impossibly long as they reached toward her. Maria's instincts screamed at her to move, to run, but her body refused to obey. The cold was paralyzing. Her muscles locked in place as the void where the creature's face should have been came closer. And then it stopped. The figure froze mid-movement, its head snapping to the side, as though listening to something only it could hear. The whispers returned, but they were different now, fainter, almost bleeding. Maria's mind raced as she watched the creature tilt its head further, the shadows around it rippling violently. A loud crash echoed through the store, coming from somewhere far behind her. The sound shattered the oppressive silence, and the figure recoiled, its form distorting as though reacting to the noise. Maria's body finally responded, her legs trembling as she stumbled backward. The figure didn't follow. Instead, it dissolved into the shadows, its form unraveling like threads of smoke until nothing remained. Maria didn't wait to see if it would return. She turned and ran, her footsteps pounding against the tile floor as she moved through the maze of aisles. The store seemed endless, the familiar layout warped and disorienting. Every turn brought her back to the same stretch of empty shelves, the air growing colder with each passing moment. The whispers followed her, growing louder and more frenzied, their chaotic voices blending into a symphony of dread. Her vision blurred as tears filled her eyes, the taste of metallic air making her gag. She turned a corner and nearly collapsed in relief as she saw the faint outline of the exit ahead. The glass doors stood slightly ajar, their automatic mechanism broken and leaving a narrow gap just wide enough for her to slip through. She sprinted toward them, her breath hitching as the shadows around her seemed to reach out, their tendrils clawing at her heels. She pushed through the doors and stumbled into the cold night air, her knees giving out as she collapsed onto the pavement. The parking lot was eerily still, the faint glow of the streetlights casting long, empty shadows across the asphalt. Maria turned back toward the store, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. The darkness beyond the glass doors seemed to press against them, pulsing faintly as though alive. And then, from deep within the store, she saw it. A faint light flickering in the distance, accompanied by the soft,